Hi kids, it's Mrs. Vanderpaul back with the next chapter of The Velvet Room. In our last chapter, Dreams Lost and Found, Robin wakes up in the McCurdy's house with her arm bandaged. She remembers that she got hurt trying to stop Fred Criley and two other boys from burning down Las Palmeras. She tells Mr. McCurdy that it was Fred and his friends that were the ones that broke into the house, and Mr. McCurdy tells Robin that they found the key to the well hanging around her neck and asked her where she got it. She knows she has to keep Bridget's secret, so she tells him that she found it. Then Robin tells Dad that she is not going to stay with Gwen. She's going to go with the rest of the family to Uncle Joe's. So here's chapter 24 of The Velvet Room. Goodbyes aren't easy. It had been decided that Robin was to stay at the McCurdys until the following morning, when Dr. Woods would be back to look at her hand. She had a late supper in bed in the guest room next to Gwen's, the room that was to have been hers if she'd stayed. Gwen brought a tray up too and ate with Robin to keep her company. Something, perhaps a letdown after all the excitement or the after effects of the sedative, made Robin feel silly and lightheaded. They got the giggles over something and laughed until absolutely everything seemed hysterically funny. They kept on laughing until their sides ached and tears rolled down their faces. Once in a while, Robin stopped laughing long enough to remember that she would have to tell Gwen about her decision not to stay. But she couldn't do it just yet. It would have to be sometime when she could go home to the cabin right afterward. The next morning, Robin was trying to make the bed, the big, soft bed, almost 3 times as wide as the one she shared with Theda, when there was a knock on the door. It wasn't Gwen as she expected, but Mr. McCurdy. He asked how she was feeling and peeked under the bandages on her hand to see if the swelling had gone down. Then, just as she thought he was leaving, he sat down instead and just looked at her. "Robin, I've been puzzled about something, and maybe you could set me straight. It's about the key you found, the one to the underground exit." Robin swallowed hard. She should have known it was too good to be true. Everyone's accepting her story about finding the key. Her folks could, perhaps, because they didn't know much about Palmera's house, but not the McCurdys. "You said you found it in a box," Mr. McCurdy was saying. "Could you tell me where the box was?" "Well," Robin began, keeping her eyes down, "it was in this old wooden box down in it was in the—" And then she broke down altogether and said nothing at all for a moment. Finally she gave up with an anguished wail. "I can't tell you! I can't tell you! I promised!" Mr. McCurdy took her hand and pulled her down on the footstool beside him. "Here now," he said, "don't get yourself all upset. You don't have to tell me anything if you don't want to, and I wouldn't ask you to break any promise. But how would it be if I already knew the secret that you're keeping? Then it wouldn't be breaking a promise to talk about it, would it?" Robin shook her head slowly. "I guess not." "Well then, it occurred to me that you might have gotten the key from Bridget. Am I right?" Robin stared at him. "Do you really know the secret?" she asked. "Bridget's secret?" He nodded. "But how? I mean, Bridget said that nobody knew except me." "A lawyer told me. When Bridget first came back to Santa Luisa, she went to see a lawyer about claiming part of Las Palmeras." "Yes," Robin said, "I know. She told me that." "Well, Bill Weber, the lawyer, happened to be a friend of mine. He thought Bridget might be a fake, and he came to the house that night to talk to me about it. She hadn't asked him to keep it secret at that time, so he didn't feel like he was betraying a confidence. It was the next day when she sent him a message saying she had decided not to tell, at least not right away. But I was sure she was no fake from the moment I saw her." "Does Mrs. McCurdy know? And Gwen too?" "Not Gwen, but Mrs. McCurdy knows. I told her immediately, and when Bridget applied for the housekeeper's job, we decided to hire her and wait and see what would happen." "Were you angry?" Robin asked. "I mean, about her being bonita?" "Angry? No, I don't think we were angry. We were a little worried at first about what would happen, but you can't know Bridget for long and distrust her motives. As we got to know her better, we decided to respect her wish for secrecy and wait until she was ready to tell us. And she never has. Why did she tell you?" Robin took a deep breath and told Mr. McCurdy all about it. That she hadn't known Bridget's secret until Friday evening, when Bridget had told her to keep her from making a big mistake. She tried to explain without hurting Mr. McCurdy's feelings that even though she liked him and Gwen and Mrs. McCurdy, she had really been going to stay because of the Velvet Room. "I guess it sounds crazy," she said, "but I'd started believing that it was more important than anything else. And Bridget wanted me to see that it shouldn't make that much difference." Mr. McCurdy nodded in a way that made Robin know that he understood. "We'll be sorry to see you go," he said, "but I think you've made an admirable decision. To tell you the truth, Robin, I wasn't happy about taking you away from your family. They're a fine bunch, and you're very important to them." Mr. McCurdy was starting out the door when Robin called him back. "I was just thinking what you said about Bridget," she said, "that you weren't angry that she was really bonita." "Yes," Mr. McCurdy nodded. "Well, when I asked Bridget why she hadn't told anybody who she was, she said it was mostly because she liked you and Mrs. McCurdy so much. She didn't want to risk changing you the way her aunt and uncle were changed when they found out that Las Palmeras was going to belong to her. I was just thinking it might make her happy to know that you know and that you're not angry about it." Mr. McCurdy didn't say anything for a while, but then he put his hand on Robin's shoulder and said, "You may be right. We'll have to think about it." The next Tuesday morning, Robin woke up reluctantly. It was the Williamses' last day at Las Palmeras. Dad had already postponed their departure for 2 days, and there was no reason to do it again. Uncle Joe was probably going to be mad as it was. Not that they could have helped it, because they couldn't. The police had wanted Robin handy in case there were more questions, and Dr. Woods had wanted to be sure that there were no bones broken in her hand. But yesterday Fred Criley had come back and turned himself in, and his 2 accomplices had been captured in Los Angeles, so the police didn't need Robin any longer, and the swelling was almost gone from her hand. So Wednesday, the bags and boxes would be back on the roof and running boards of the Model T, and the Williams family would be back on the road again. The thought made Robin close her eyes tight and hope that she wasn't really awake. But of course she was. When she opened her eyes and thought about it clearly, she realized this wasn't quite as bad as all the other times. At least there was an end in sight. It was much better to be going somewhere instead of anywhere, even if it was only to Uncle Joe's. Uncle Joe's. What would it be like to live there? It didn't seem probable that Uncle Joe would have changed for the better, but maybe he wasn't as bad as Robin remembered him. It was hard to picture the tourist cottages exactly, but it seemed as if some of them were almost as big as the cabins in Palmeras Village. Besides, the cottages had indoor bathrooms, which was certainly an improvement. And if they were fixed up a bit, they might not be so desolate looking. Uncle Joe had said in his letter that he was going to open them for tourists again, so maybe he would have some painting done. Maybe he'd even plant a little lawn. The sound of someone moving across the room interrupted Robin's thoughts. It was Rudy getting up to light the fire in the stove. In a few minutes he crawled back into his cot to wait for the room to warm up. Carrie was still sound asleep at the other end of the bed, curled up in a small mound. Near him on the floor were his sword and shield, and his hand on the pillow was clenched into a fist. Poor Carrie, Robin thought, and wondered why. It had something to do with the clenched fist and the beat-up old garbage can lid. It wasn't much of a shield for somebody so little and so determined about everything. Thinking about Carrie, Robin smiled suddenly. He'd been so funny the last few days. He'd been telling everyone that Robin had saved Palmera's house. In Carrie's version, one of the bandits hit Robin's hand with a great big flashlight, but she just took it away from him and hit him right back. And then she put out a huge fire and chased the bandits away all by herself. And as Carrie put it, Robin was a hero and would probably get a golden medal. It had gotten so that every time Robin went outside, all the younger village kids gathered around her and asked her to see her hand. She tried to explain that Carrie had exaggerated, but she couldn't help feeling pleased by all the admiration. She sighed and tucked her feet up against Theta's warm back. She would have missed Carrie if she'd decided to stay with Gwen. Carrie, and Shirley too. Funny little frightened Shirley. And everybody. She was glad, really glad that they wouldn't be driving away tomorrow without her. That was one thing that she was sure of, even if she couldn't be glad about leaving Las Palmeras. It hadn't been easy to give it all up. There had been times when she had wavered. One of the worst had been when she had to tell Gwen. Gwen had cried, and Robin felt just awful. She hadn't believed before that it mattered that much to Gwen. Down underneath, she had thought that it was sort of a whim of Gwen's, like wanting to have a party or a certain new coat. But Gwen didn't cry about things like coats and parties. There had been another bad time when she had to go to Lincoln School for her transfer. She had counted on so much finishing the year at Lincoln, 1 whole year at the same school. But maybe the hardest of all had been saying goodbye to Bridget. But at least she wouldn't have to worry about Bridget being lonely and unhappy. The McCurdy's had told her that they knew her secret, and Bridget was happier than she'd been in years. Not that it meant much of a change in her life. She was quite content in her little cottage and her little animal family. But it was nice, she said, to feel like she was a McCurdy again. And Mr. McCurdy had asked her to help him with the history of Las Palmeras. She was really excited about that. He'd even asked her to serve as an advisor on the board of his historical society. The cabin was warmer now, so Robin slid out of bed and got down the coffee pot. She filled it with water from the old green faucet and put it on the stove. It was going to be a busy day for all of the Williamses. They might as well get started. So that's the end of chapter 24, Goodbyes Aren't Easy. The next chapter is our last, and that chapter is called Want to Come Along? So I'll be back soon for the next chapter. Thanks for listening and keep reading.